Yes, so hello again to you, everyone. Welcome to the Children's Mental Health Matters webinar. My name is Angie McRae. I'm the Child and Family Engagement Manager here at Mental Health Association of Maryland. And again, welcome to our July webinar series. Today's topic is grief and the weight it carries, an exploration of grief, healing, and acceptance. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available to you in the coming week. Our speaker today is Adriana Espinoza from the Children's Mental Health Matters campaign sponsor, Breakthrough Therapeutics. Adriana will focus on identifying various types of loss one may face throughout their lifetime and complications that may arise. We will discuss similarities in emotional and nervous system responses and review resources to help guide your clients or loved ones. Adriana, a New Jersey transplant, moved to Maryland nearly a decade ago with her husband, children, and Great Dane. As a certified suicide bereavement clinician, she specializes in grief and trauma counseling. Adriana enjoys teaching classes and workshops that help individuals cope with various types of losses, both physical and ambiguous. Her experience extends to working with foster youth, first responders, and trauma survivors in her community. She provides services to children, young adults transitioning to independence, and adults of all ages. Adriana, we thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. The pressure is on. Hi, I'm Adriana. I'm going to be doing the presentation today. Um, as was explained a little bit about me, when I first came to Maryland, I started um, as a Bachelor of Social Work, and I got my licensure. I started working with immigration foster youth. And then as I moved up in my license and I licensed at the master's level, I started working with foster youth. And that's kind of what really gave me, uh, put me knee deep in grief and trauma, if you will. Just the sheer amount of loss in the communities that I was serving at the time and doing crisis intervention in Baltimore City schools really just led me to really want to focus on the clinical aspect of treating the loss, when I was able to see that generational influence of what happens when that trauma goes unaddressed and how it bleeds into that next generation. So yeah, I started really getting very heavy in exploring trauma and grief. I've been working in therapy for coming up on 6 years now. I did my suicide bereavement certification with the National Suicide Prevention Association, and I have been with Breakthrough coming up on a year, towards the end of next month. So very exciting. I have a lot of hope for this demographic and really want to be able to address the needs of this community more. So, all right, getting into it. So grief and loss are grief is defined as a deep sorrow. Webster's defines it as distress caused by bereavement. Now, bereavement can be defined as some kind of physical loss. Sometimes it's not necessarily a permanent loss, right? We talk about that abstract loss of somebody is still alive or somebody is still, very physically here, like a breakup. But we no longer have access to them, and that would still be covered under this. The loss is on the other hand of that grief. The loss is the process that we go through in the bereavement. So grief becomes complicated depending on the type of loss it is. Typically, this is where I have my interactive piece, so everything's up on here, so just bear with me. So as you go through life, you go through what we call expected losses, right? We expect to, as children, to one day grow up and go to college or start working and move out of our parents' house and get our own place. Those are all exciting things in life, these transitions. we expect as we age to not be able to do the things, that we could at 30, at 20, at 17, even at 6. Um, we expect as we continue to age, and get into the throes of life, that the people older than us are going to at some point pass. We expect to lose our parents later in life. We expect to lose our siblings once we start to get into, our 80s. If we have pets, the reality is their longevity is not nearly as long as a human's, unless you have like a tortoise or a parrot, then, Godspeed, that's going to outlive you. Um, but for the most part, if you have a dog, that it will very likely die in your lifetime. And so these are things that we expect. And because the expectation is there and it is more of a universal experience, the experience is different. Now, considering unexpected losses. As I mentioned in the beginning, some of these transitions of going to college, moving out of your parents' home, getting married, having a baby, these are all exciting things. But at the end of the day, it's still an end of something that was. And for some people, they experience that a little bit harder than others. So we look at life transitions. Um, Empty nesters is a huge thing now, especially when a parent has focused their life around their child and their child no longer needs them to be an active parent in that capacity. Their child is now an adult. And so, what do you do with yourself? And sometimes it leaves you feeling like you've lost that purpose. Loss of a job. Now, sometimes, often when we change jobs, we're doing it for the better. It is exciting. We have applied, we are looking to change specialties. Um, but there are some times where it's unexpected. Sometimes you lose the job, sometimes the job moves and you can't move with it. And that becomes a much bigger influence on you and your life. um, Promotion. It comes with extra responsibility. However, it sets you apart of what was. Again, that change, that, okay, well, I can no longer go to happy hour with the crew because now I'm a supervisor. And now I kind of feel excluded. And, this was a happy thing, but it's a change. As I said, marriage, pregnancy, childbirth. Pregnancy is huge. I just went through it for like the millionth time. um and it always surprises me like how exciting it is, but how fragile it is and how much loss it has. Each stage you don't go back to. And then you have your baby, and that's wonderful, but at the same time they're no longer inside you. It's no longer this little secret that you have. The kicks aren't just yours, and there's definitely a loss in that. And then on the other side of that, you have miscarriage. These are things that, when we hope to get pregnant, we don't expect to have to experience. Unplanned moves. Hey, my job is moving across the country and it's either be jobless or move with it. I was anticipating this. And so leaving my community, leaving my family, leaving the grocery store, or the doctor that I've been going to for the last 10 years, my kids, having to uproot them. We expect to get illness at some point in our lives. However, having a severe or a chronic illness or a disability to where you can no longer live the life that you were living is a very extreme loss. We expect to have, physical capacity in our youth, and yet we could get into an accident today, tomorrow, and our life could completely change. And that is a very um that is a very real thing for many people. I'm gonna jump around a little bit. Divorce, that's a big one. Not often, we get married and we're like, yeah, this will probably end. You expect it to be for life. You expect the partner that you select to be there through the ups and downs and to be able to navigate things. And sometimes that's just a sad reality, is that that is not the case for many different reasons. And so now finding yourself back to being by yourself, to having to do things by yourself and take care of the mortgage or the rent by yourself, or raise children by yourself, or even co-parent with someone else who has a very different style than you. You know, these are all very real things. Natural disasters are a big one, especially in this environment. Um, you know, yes, we plan for the worst, but not often do we realize that, you know, that could be a very real reality. And when we have to suffer through it, it is not only traumatic, but it's something that is not widely experienced. This is not an experience that the majority of people have and can really understand. And then, saving the best for last, premature death of your parents, your siblings, minor children, and adult children. These are perhaps the biggest ones that come to mind when people think about the unexpected losses, because as a young parent, you don't expect, well, as a parent, yeah, as a young parent, you don't expect to bury, you know, your young kids. As a aging adult, you don't expect to bury your adult children. It is a cruel, cruel turn of events. um Losing a sibling when you're a child, even when you're a young adult, is very difficult, because chances are it was something unexpected that took their life, and it was not something that was a slow progression of age to where you feel like they got to live their life. And again, you expect to lose your parents, but you don't expect to lose your parents at 12 or at 5, or sometimes even at, you know, 25. You're still very young. You know, you're just trying to figure out who you are and likely getting settled into adulthood yourself. And so to lose your parent, you know, at that young, you know, very vulnerable age is traumatizing. And so that leads us to the differences between the two. The reality is expected losses have a universal understanding. I can talk to somebody my age, and chances are they left their parents' house. Hey, you know what? My water bill just went up $50. And having that conversation with someone my age, you know, they'll get it. Oh yeah, you know what? I really struggled. My gas and electric bill went up too, and now I'm thinking of getting a part-time job. You know, there's an understanding, there's a sympathy. You know, you have shared experiences, the sense of being understood. For expected losses, we have support groups for pet parents now, you know, pet parents who have suffered the loss of their animal. There is support, there is a universal understanding, there are resources. So there are support groups, there are therapists that are trained just to focus, you know, on these areas. There are ways that you can be helped. You can have conversations, you know, with random strangers or with your peers, and feel like you're leaving with a sense of, okay, you know what, they get it. I feel validated. I don't feel so alone in this. The difference with unexpected losses is, if your house burned down and you lost two of your family members and all of your items, you talk to your neighbor, they're not really going to understand. They'll be sympathetic, of course, because most people are human at nature. But they're not going to understand the weight and the gravity that goes into it. You know, the complications of losing your family member in such a traumatic way and likely being there for their last moments, or knowing that they didn't survive and you did, losing everything that you own. And now even that concept is such a big thing to understand, because we think, okay, well, you know, I can replace a lot of things, but you know, the scarf that your grandmother knit that you had, you know, since you were a baby, that's irreplaceable, and you can't make another one, especially if your grandma's gone. You know, the family pictures that were passed down from your grandmother to your mom that were in the house, those are gone. Yes, I can replace birth certificates and I can replace driver's license, but the reality is it's not an easy process to get it in the first place. And then having to prove your identity without proof of identity is very difficult. And so, yeah, some of these things can be replaced, but it's arduous. It is a difficult process, and it goes through certain steps. And the reality is, people don't understand the things that you go through. And because of that, there is not as much support, there is not as much understanding. You don't have that community. And if you do, it's a very small community. And so your support system is likely very minimal. The resources in which you're able to be helped, as a trauma therapist, um, there are certain things that I'm trained in, certain things that I've been exposed to. I've worked with first responders. I've worked, with people who have, suffered generational trauma. I have not counseled, people who have survived a school shooting. And in all honesty, I don't know how I would feel about it, especially having not gone through it myself. That is a very unique experience that somebody has gone through, and sometimes you want the validation of somebody just having stepped where you stepped. Okay. So, when does grief become complicated? So, these are my two case studies. Give me a second. I'm going to read one. Um, and then I'll read the other, and then I'll kind of analyze. So Martha is a 42-year-old woman who reported waking up in cold sweats every night this past week after reliving the car accident in which she walked away from, and her teenage daughter didn't. Since the accident happened a month ago, she has gotten very little sleep, has reduced appetite, and has not brought herself to enter her deceased daughter's room. Okay, big takeaways here is Martha is about middle-aged, suffered a car accident about a month ago, which is still very recent. She's starting to have some negative symptoms. Um, and however, she is showing that knee deep in it, if you will. I can't enter my daughter's room. I am not ready to get to that place. Now looking at Joe, who's a 32-year-old man who lost his wife of 8 years to a short battle with a very aggressive brain cancer.
Oh,
Joe told his
heard about
therapist he
it.
feels like one second he was sitting with his wife in the doctor's office, and less than 2 months later, he was standing over her grave. Although a death occurred 3 years ago, he refuses to speak of his wife, still wears his ring, reports disrupted sleep, nightmares, and significant depressive episodes. The therapist noted he cannot say or hear his wife's name without breaking down into the throes of a panic attack. Now, this is a very different situation. The biggest thing when you are approaching this in a clinical sense is looking at the concept of time. Um, in the grief setting, I would expect the first couple weeks, whether it's an expected or an unexpected loss, to be shock. Some people are completely numb to it and have a very strange reaction. Some people are very emotionally aware and very emotionally engaging in the process. Um, for somebody to lose their daughter a month ago and not be willing to go into their room, that's a normal expectation. I see that every day. Chances are, I mean, it might take 6 months, it might take a year before they're ready. Now comparing it to Joe, whose wife died 3 years ago, Joe is still very knee deep in it, whereas Martha is likely having a normal experience, and as time progresses, it will it doesn't necessarily go away, but you become accustomed to the extra weight that grief carries. You understand your triggers, you have found a way to deal with them. Whereas Joe is not completing that grief cycle. He is still having pretty significant symptoms, which I would likely see probably within the first 3 months. If it has been 3 years, that is a significant amount of time to where I would hope and expect that the majority of these symptoms would be significantly less. The other issue that kind of flashes out at me is that Martha lost her daughter in a very sudden event. There was no hope that she could get better. There was no hope that she is surviving this. Her daughter is dead. And that kind of propels you through the process because there is no other alternative. In Joe's situation, excuse me, in Joe's situation, as Joe said, he woke up and from one day to the next felt like he was in the doctor's office and then he was standing over his grave. So there's not a whole lot of time for that shock to wear off, to really process what's going on because things are happening so quickly. And yet, in that instance, it is also um um it is also pretty significant to say that when you're battling something like an illness of that extent, especially brain cancer, not only is the decline quick, but you still have that fleeting hope. The person is still here. And granted, 2 months is not a long amount of time, but the person is still here for days, for weeks. And because of that, there is hope, even if we don't want it to be there. That is just human nature. And so Joe is likely very conflicted and had a lot of difficulty in accepting that this is likely the end, probably because he wasn't sure if it would be. That's how illness works. We don't know if somebody's going to pull through, if somebody's not. We just have to kind of wait for the progression. And because of that, that can also complicate factors as well. Wait, Konya, come on. Okay. So, what does grief look like? Just a few symptoms. Traditionally, I see you're going to expect somebody to cry randomly. Sometimes this looks like a constant crying or prickling of the eyes throughout the day. Sometimes it looks like I'm absolutely fine. And then I'm walking in the mall with my child and somebody's wearing the cologne of my dead husband. And now I can't take it and I'm breaking down. Um, Sudden onset of intense feeling of sadness. Again, these triggers can be something little like, perfume that somebody's wearing, or passing by that painting that they insisted on hanging up even though you thought it was ugly. um just those knee-jerk feelings that are a bit unexpected. Anger. A lot of times people are experiencing anger as they're going through this cycle. Why did they die? Why did things go like this? Sometimes it becomes more complicated, especially when the grief is complicated. Why did they kill themselves? How did I not see these signs? How is it that the doctors, we went to 5 doctors and not one of them caught the cancer before it
Mm.
was progressed to a place that we could not come back from? Feelings of guilt. These are a normal experience. However, in complicated grief, feelings of guilt tend to be more intense because they feel like there's something that they could have done to prevent this. Not crying is also a completely normal response. Again, depending on where you are and what you have going on, the complications of the grief can absolutely affect one's ability to cry. Um, Say an only child is a multi-generational caregiver, loses a parent, and still has a parent that is now dependent on them, they are likely not going to be able to get themselves to the place where they're even able to process the death because they're so busy going through the tasks of grief, ordering the birth certificate or the death certificate. I'm sorry. Making sure their surviving parent has a roof over their head, going through the items, going through probate, going through the estate. There's still so much that is demanding while you are juggling your family or other responsibilities, that some people don't have the emotional capacity to even think about the loss or how it affects them because they're just still in survival mode. And oftentimes, when I have a client or a patient who is not crying initially, it will come the second they're no longer treading water. Once they have their feet on solid ground, then it's like a snowball of just massive emotion. Um, Feelings of dissociation at the beginning. Again, completely normal. I would expect to see that in the first month, sometimes in the first couple months of, I can't believe this has happened. No. Um, However, I would not expect to see this a year later. Um, Shock, of course. Loss of appetite, disrupted sleep. Sometimes I see the opposite of that, of, people using food as a coping skill. People doing all they want to do is sleep. Withdrawal from family and friends, loss of focus and poor concentration. I think this is one of these two are some of the things that I see most often, because you are in that place to where you're on survival mode. You likely have other responsibilities, you're dealing with so many things, and so because your brain is so split and your responsibilities are so split, it would make sense that you're using more than your capacity to bear. And so when that happens, obviously your body's going to take away from something. And typically it's your memory, it's your concentration. Um, Impulsivity. Sometimes, especially if I see a client that is more closed down and not processing, sometimes, those unsavory coping skills come out to play. And so I see that impulsivity of, okay, well, you know what, they died. Oh my God, I almost died. I need to live my life. I am going to spend all of my savings on, a boat because I've always wanted a boat. Okay. Okay. So complicated grief. Commonly acknowledged as symptoms of grief continuing in their intensity and severity over a year after the event. So, again, I spoke a little bit about some risk factors or some things that we see. However, big risk factors for grief to become more complicated: childhood trauma, when they have, which also leads me to the relationship that they had with the person or the thing that they lost. Um, when these complications arise, it becomes much harder to work through the grief process because it is not as clean or as easy as one would think. When your abuser has died, you're not just focusing and trying to confront the fact that they're no longer there. And one would argue it would be a sense of relief. And oftentimes it is, which is what complicates the grief because, hey, I'm glad they're dead. But at the same time, there's the very real, wow, this is, my parent. This is my family member. This is somebody that I have feelings for. It's my husband, it's my wife. Um, and I'm never going to get the opportunity to tell them how I feel or tell them how they hurt me. Or they're really never going to be my mom. They're never going to realize what they did to me. And because of the weight of that, because of the complexity of that, and the inability to deal with the emotional ramifications of that, it makes the grief more complicated because there are a lot more things at play. The
Adriana?
loss is an unexpected one. As we discussed, having an unexpected loss is something that is not universally understood. And so finding that peer support, finding the support of your community, even just being able to talk about it sometimes. I've had people who come to me after having a miscarriage, and state that, hey, I tried telling my mom and my mom was like, well, you can just try for another one. Or, you're still young, you'll get pregnant again, or, oh, well, it wasn't a real baby yet. And so because that sense of understanding is so warped and misunderstood, none of those comments make you feel better. And so, because you feel like you can't talk about it, oftentimes people don't. And so they hold it, and it just continues to manifest in various ways.
Adriana?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to bring a question in the chat to your attention.
Yeah.
Lolita asks about the memory loss. How long do you expect the memory loss and loss of focus and poor concentration to last?
Oof. That is a tough one. I think it would kind of, so typically I see it for about 3 to 6 months, depending on, again, the relationship with the person. If this is like a coworker, it's not going to affect you the way it is a parent. Or if this was a parent that, lived across the country and you didn't get to see on a regular basis as an adult, your your experience is going to be much different from that who lived, two houses down from their parent and saw them multiple times a week. So I think the closer you are with the person that you lose and the more complex that relationship is, the longer I can see those symptoms, I mean, honestly, I think the longest I've seen it reported was a year. And typically it gets better with time, as long as you're actively working through the loss. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Um, Other risk factors, codependency on the person lost. So um if you are an older couple and you lose your partner, then okay, well now I'm incapable of living alone. This person made my meals for me. This person took me to the doctors. This person made sure that the security alarm was set at night. You're not just losing the physical person, you're losing your sense of security. You're losing now your sense of self because you were dependent on them. Again, feelings of guilt due to the circumstances of the loss or the complications of them. Connection to the person or the item lost. Sometimes it is, again, not so much the person, it is how close we are or what we feel our relationship to them is. Um, if somebody is, I'm trying to think of a concrete example. So if I am losing my soccer coach, for most people, that might not be a big thing. But if I've had the same soccer coach for 10 years, they saw me through nationals, they became a friend of the family, they came over for family functions. This is no longer just a soccer coach. This is somebody that is part of my, normal part, become part of my community. And so that is going to greaten the loss for me. um your beliefs and background. Sometimes this is where religion and spirituality come into play. This is where those cultural differences come into play. I have seen people who have some sense of spirituality or faith, or religion, have somewhat of an easier time with it because they have that hope that they're going to be reunited in the future. Sometimes I see people who are spiritual in the sense that they believe in reincarnation, or they believe that, okay, well, what, this person's at peace. I do think that it is significantly worse for people who don't have a set feeling of what happens now, because then that fear sets in. Well, are they just gone? Well, or am I ever going to see them again? And it becomes a much stronger reaction. Okay. So supporting our clients, patients, and community in their healing journey. Um, Healing looks so different from person to person. I think that there is not necessarily a um there is not necessarily a one path suits everybody. Um, when we're supporting our patients, the biggest thing to understand is that, it is a very individual experience. It's not something that can be rushed. It is not something that we can necessarily, as we help them navigate, we cannot necessarily tell them the steps that are ahead. Part of it is understanding the process of the loss, validating, and just helping them to feel not alone. And just really reiterating and encouraging them to understand that whatever they're going through is very normal. Um, Depending on, the journey, I think that it is so difficult for people to, the biggest thing that I hear people say is this normal? Or I feel like I should be at this point by now, or I feel like I'm steps behind. And the biggest thing that I tell people is that, yeah, just because, Joe down the street, lost his dad and or lost his wife, and 2 months later he's remarried, doesn't mean that that's your journey. Your experiences are different, your understanding is different, your needs are different. And so it's understanding all of these different dynamics and understanding that your experience is your experience. And if you feel like crying, then we cry. We find ways that we can cry. We find ways that we can process. If you don't feel like crying, then that's fine too. And it's not a reflection on your emotional connection or your, feelings towards, this individual that you lost. It's simply different people need different things and different people process things in different ways. When I did bereavement counseling at a hospice center, one of the clients I had, came and it was just a one session thing. And he was like, yeah, I'm a medical provider and, I lost my mom and I felt like I should be here. And the conversation was like, do you feel like you need counseling? Do you feel like there's something to talk about? And he went into a very analytical assessment of his parents' decline, and he was like, "Yeah, I mean, this was the expected course. I knew this from the beginning once I got that diagnosis." And I said, "Okay, so why did you come here?" And he was like, "Well, everybody else seems really upset about it, and I felt like I should be, more upset, or I should be in a different place." I told them, well, their experience is different. Especially as a medical provider, you have the knowledge of, okay, I already know where this is going to go. And I think that's an important concept um, to bring up is that your when you get into a situation and you are understanding of what the road looks like ahead. Let me think of a certain example. So when you receive a diagnosis and they tell you, hey, this is terminal, as the support person, as the person who is understanding that you're going to lose this family member, this person that you love, to this process, you have the understanding that this is not something that they're going to survive. And so this ambiguous loss starts the grieving process before the person is physically lost. So typically we see this um in memory care and people with dementia and people with these chronic long-term disabilities and illnesses. Sometimes people get cancer and they go in remission and they get it again and they get it again. um and you have the idea that, okay, they've already had it a few times, each time is getting progressively worse, this is likely something that is going to claim their life at some point. And so you go through the process of grief before that person is deceased, and sometimes it does make it a little bit easier because you're starting things earlier. Your loss is different and you're forced to face the fact that the person that you love is starting to lose little bits of who they are. And so you are losing, the memories that you had with them, the things that you used to do with them. You're caring for them in a way that you hadn't before. And because of these things, it kind of helps the grieving process along because it's more prolonged versus a kind of shock of, hey, surprise, here it is. Um, so in that situation, for that doctor, I told him, I was like, you've been grieving. So for you to display, a big emotional response would be more unexpected because chances are you already grieved the loss of your mom. You already knew that she was going and you already had your moments. Um, and hopefully, maximize, the time that you had with her. Um, and so, of course, I don't expect to see such significant symptoms now. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily go like that, but that is, at least in my experience, how it's been. Um, Healing is support. It is being there for your client or your patient. It's validating their journey. It's just being able to um, continue and support and help them through. And um, sometimes it's referring them to medication management, especially if you're in those early days and that shock is significant and it's having that physiological response to where their blood pressure is rising and staying high. or they're no longer getting out of bed and it's been weeks, or they're dropping massive amounts of weight, or they're gaining massive amounts of weight. Sometimes they do need that clinical support. Um, Support groups are a big thing at this point. Some people are very resistant to them. Others really like the validation of hearing that other people are struggling too. And for some, it's just too much. My experience is too much. I can't take on the emotional burden of hearing everybody else's. And that's fine. Situations like that, the support becomes more reflective. It becomes journaling. It becomes, okay, well, how do I continue to navigate this if I am no longer in a group setting? Okay. So this brings us to the four attacks of grief. So this was a framework created by William Worden to better understand the tasks one goes through in the loss process. Perfect. Okay. So first task is to accept the reality of the loss. So acknowledge and accepting the person or thing will not return. Here I do a lot of narrative therapies, examining the details of the loss. We will go through it, sometimes many, many times. Here is really, we're working on their ability to just process the experience. Sometimes it means going back and processing the relationship. But we are recounting the loss. We were recounting the way the person was lost. We were recounting where we were when we found out. Were we there in the room? What was their person who we lost experience? What was our experience? Identifying how things are different now that this person is gone. So then task 2 is working through the pain. So here's where we start to work through the emotions. We are now processed and work through the specifics of it. And sometimes that's a big thing because, again, that memory lost aspect. Sometimes people have gaps. I know they died. I watched them die, but I don't remember the last thing that they said, or I don't remember what they were wearing. So instead of processing specific details, we're now working through the emotions. Okay, so how did I feel, when I saw them that last time? How did I feel when, they took my hand? Or how did I feel when the police came to my door? Or when I experienced this or that? So typically in this area, we do a lot of journaling. I'm big on narrative therapy to begin with. I do verbal, I do written. Sometimes, we incorporate art into it or poetry. So a lot of my techniques are going to be some kind of offset of that. So here I do a lot of journaling, either verbal or written, writing letters. I always give people the option of a letter is paper, it can be burned, it can be destroyed. This is up to you. And that provides one, a sense of control, but two, a sense of freedom. And I don't want this just sitting here. Sometimes it is the release of being able to, destroy all of the things that I've written down. This is also where therapy is helpful because in task 1, sometimes, you process with family, you process with friends, every person I talk to, yeah, my mom died and, this is what it was. And then, they share their experience and, we can kind of go through it. Working through the pain is typically where therapy comes in. And we'll do task 1 too, but task 2 really focuses on the clinical aspect of healing and the physical symptoms. Task 3 is a fun one. Adjusting to a world without the deceased. So tasks 3 and 4 tend to be where it kind of gets a little bit tricky. Sometimes it happens all at once. It happens fast and you don't realize it happens. You are adapting to a new reality. Chances are, if you lose your partner, the parent to, the other parent to your children, you're going to complete task 3 real quick because there is no other option, right? You have to work, you have to clean the house, you have to cook, you have to parent your kids. If your partner's gone, those things still need to be completed. It's supporting your patient in giving them grace and being gentle with themselves and understanding that, okay, yeah, the dishes still need to be done. They can't be piled up for weeks, but paper plates are a very viable option. Or if the dishes sit for a day, things will not fall apart and CPS will not come to the door. You know, find opportunities to give yourself the time that you need while still being realistic. Okay, I was doing laundry every day. Well, you also had a partner kind of tag teaming in. So if laundry not every day is not an option, then okay, so how can I address this? Do I have the finances to get help? Do I have a support member or family member that's able to come stay or come help out with this specific task? um maybe I just do it a few times a week, or maybe some of my kids are old enough that they can do their own laundry, and here's a basket, I need you to take on this responsibility. um Adapting to a new reality is very different for adults than it is for kids. So for those of you who work with kids or considering kids in this, adapting to a new reality is much more difficult because of the semblance of control that children tend to not have in their lives. Um, in that situation or in that example that I just gave, well, that can be really helpful for a parent who needs more support. For a child, oh, my dad just died, and here I am growing up. Like now I'm doing my own laundry. You're starting to lose little pieces of your childhood in this transition that is kind of being, you know, pushed on you. Um, and unfortunately, that is the reality of it. There are going to be changes. There are going to be redefined roles, especially if it's within that intimate family or that nuclear family dynamic. Um, Here is typically where I help patients identify triggers and area of familiarity that will change. So, one of the first things that we talk about when we're kind of coming up to this task is, okay, so how did your home function? Or what was your relationship like? If it's depending on who it is, if it's somebody who is into their intimate world and their daily world, um okay, well, what roles did he have, or what roles did she have? Were they disciplinarian? Were they the one making all the doctor's appointments? Okay, so these are roles that now need to be taken by somewhere else. These are things that we need to look at proactively because there is no longer somebody who's going to be managing them. So my approach is we do a very specific, this is a task oriented session, to where, okay, let's think of all the things that we can think of. Who does the doctor's appointments? Who picks up medications? Who is scheduling, doing the school registration? um who's sending out Christmas cards? Sometimes it's not even a big, okay, we all think of doctor's appointments or medications, or we all think about who is cleaning out the gutters. We don't think about who is scheduling the pictures for the Christmas card or who's signing the Christmas cards. And so little ways for this to be this to just be an easier transition and to be as proactive as possible in thinking of some of these, because the reality is, when the holidays come and those cards aren't sent out, or you start getting cards, again, we go back to that knee jerk reaction and those sharper symptoms, because it's one of those things that you don't think of and it sneaks up on you. So we really do try and be proactive and find ways to kind of support that change, and just think as much as we can about the things that will come up or the things that are going to change. So that way we can slowly prepare for that change. We can discuss it, and that little bit of kind of exposure therapy is going to kind of ease them in one toe at a time into the cooler waters. Um, I was just lost my train of thought. But another important thing of the adapting to the new reality is, um, oh my goodness, I just lost my train. It's okay. Okay, so task 4, finding a way to continue the connection with the deceased. Um, this is this is the other big one. I think it tends to complicate things a lot because sometimes the spiritual, the faith comes in here. And sometimes it is very agnostic to where it has nothing to do with faith. It is simply a way to continue a relationship with somebody who's no longer here. And as crazy as that sounds, um, we think of, okay, if I've lost, my father, yes, his physical body's gone, but not the things that he taught me, the things that we did together. These memories are what are keeping this relationship for me real. And so here is here's where I encourage people to really explore the relationship that they had with their loved one. What did you do together? What made the relationship so special? If it's a coworker or somebody a little bit more, removed, what stands out to them about, what about them stands out to you? And it's really exploring why they are or what their needs are in this moment. I've suggested to people, I've had somebody who said, my grandma I used to cook with her. Okay. Well, you used to cook with her. I'm sure she taught you, recipes, or she left you recipes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have tons. Okay. Well, it sounds like this is a way that you can continue to have that connection. This is something that you did with them. And um, in my culture, that was a way to kind of keep their memory alive. We call it the third death. We lose the body, we lose the spirit, and the third death is, when the memory is gone. And so this is a good way to keep the memory of this person alive by um by passing this on and continuing to do this. And so why don't you start, making some of these recipes once a week? You have a day to where, okay, I'm going to break out, my grandma's recipes. Or, your kids are interested in learning. This is a good way. They were too young to remember her, but this is a good way for you to share her with them, teach her the recipes, have them in conversation, and be able to do, more things.
Adriana.
Yes.
Hi. There was a question specific to to this slide, so I wanted to ask now. And for
Okay.
those, there were a couple other questions in the chat. We will circle back and talk about them at the end. But the question was, can you give an example of how you adjust some of these for divorce? The reference
Yes,
site,
that's
difficult grieving process for many in therapy.
yes. So the ambiguous loss is significant. And actually that's great. I wish I had thought of that because I definitely would have made that differentiation. So for the ambiguous loss, when we talk about, divorce, separation, um,
Hey.
using that as an example to go back to task 1, I would say, sorry, I thought I heard somebody. I would say that this is where we're recanting what the marriage was like. Typically in these ambiguous losses, this is where we tend to romanticize things and, oh, you know what? We had the best relationship. I don't know where this has come from. Um, we see things in a different way. And so it's really being analytical here and supporting them and seeing, this is not necessarily out of left field. Like you had problems, they had problems. Kind of examining what their experiences were and identifying what they want in life, what they, if the experience was, I never felt validated or I never felt like I really had a partner. Well, don't you want one? These are things that you want and that you deserve to have, and kind of putting it, doing that reframe to where it's a more, okay, these are opportunities. Working through the pain in task two, again, would be pretty typical. This is where we get more of a closure. Um, I absolutely support the journaling, the narrative therapies. Writing letters is tricky because, the words can sometimes be very messy and gross. Um, and so this is typically where I encourage the burn it method. Do not send these letters unless you have a very good relationship with that person. And even then, please don't send these letters. um, this is just for you. And this is a way to write what you need to write. And sometimes if they're like, I really need my ex-partner to know certain things, okay, then this is something that we do together. And we make sure that what you're writing is clean, what you're writing is not going to be held against you negatively. Um, but we try and keep it therapeutic in nature so that way it's positive. Now, if you're writing a letter to burn, I encourage you, that's the space to get out whatever you can't say to them because it's not so nice. It is clearly for venting. If you want to sit in your car and scream all kinds of profanities because they piss you off and, complicated things, and you guys got to go back to court, Godspeed, go ahead. This is the space to do it and not have that negative ramification. So giving the outlets, working through the pain is also where I suggest very strong coping skills and where we explore what that system looks like. And that's a good segue into task three, because those tend to be very lengthy sessions, depending on what the divorce looks like. Typically, I create a roadmap of sorts, which looks like some kind of ridiculous, like I get the poster board and we identify a bunch of different categories: childcare, summer breaks, winter breaks, holidays, um, you know, who moves around. I have kids in the house, so I'm going to say it low. Who moves around the elves, during the holidays? That's a whole big thing for kids now. So if that was your partner, guess what? Kids are expecting them to move. So you better buckle up and make sure that you got a task for each day. And if you're planning it now in August, it's a lot easier than trying to keep yourself awake past the kids and do it in the middle of, elf season. Um, so we look specifically at different areas and then we adjust depending on the parenting schedule. Sometimes I have families that are, hey, it's just me. Okay, we need to look at your support system because just you is not sufficient. Um, yes, you can, but no, you should not have to. And the reality is we are much more successful when we are in prides or we are in communities. And so, okay, childcare is tricky to afford. Okay. What about a friend's teenager? What about a college kid? Somebody that can come help you out. What about another single parent? You guys can tap out. Try and figuring out this community, try and figuring out what you can and can't do. And sometimes in this stretch, we go into I am not known for my math skills, but we go into some financials and we look at, okay, you know what? Here's what we can do. I'm going to assign you the task of talking to a financial advisor through your bank. It's free. Let's figure out how we can kind of maximize things. And so here's where we're really analytical and we try to be very direct in what supports we can provide to get them to the best thing. And so that's kind of the adjusting. And sometimes I do that for people who lost someone physically, to death as well, because the financials do change. And that is a very real thing for people. Hey, I had two incomes and one was used entirely to pay my mortgage. So how do I pay for anything else now? That is a very real concern. Let's talk about it. What resources do the community have? What emergency grants? So here is where we do that more. My case management head more comes to play, and we get into these very specific details. And for divorce, task four, sorry, I can hear my baby, so just if you hear it. So
Adriana,
task
I'm
four,
sorry, I have to jump in one more time. I just want to say, because we're at a little bit over 12:30, for those that can stay on, please do. I know, I think, Adriana, you're getting towards the end. But for anybody that has to drop off, we understand. You can access the recording but feel free to stay on. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, Adriana.
It's okay. I'm wrapping up. I'm horrible with time. Okay. So for divorce specifically, finding a way to continue the connection. Um, this is really for this is two parts. So one, as a co-parent. Okay, so this is typically where I send or I say, okay, we're going to do some family sessions. We're going to talk about co-parenting because the reality is your house and your house do not have to look the same. You have the right to parent as you want. You have the right to parent as you want. But if you are forced to work together or have to come to agreements on certain things as per the court order, then the reality is it's not going to be your way or their way. You guys have to figure out something in the middle. So we do a lot of co-parenting here. We do a lot of, okay, so how do I be cordial? How do I communicate while still not complicating things legally or, setting some unreasonable expectations. So we do a lot of boundary work for parents who are trying to support their kids. It is okay, you know what? You miss dad. I know you don't want to be at mom's house right now. How about we make him a letter? Why don't you draw him a picture? Why don't you call dad? It's finding ways to honor that relationship because the reality is that is their father, that is their mother. But it's doing it in a way that upholds boundaries. It's doing it in a way that's safe. And again, sticking to the court order. Because if you're like, okay, you miss dad, how about I just, you just go to dad's for the day? This becomes a constant problem. And the longer it goes out, the harder it is for them to adjust. So the best thing is to do something that's going to be a more permanent solution. Okay. My last little tidbit is the reality is, um, grief doesn't necessarily go away, right? Because people don't come back from the dead. When we divorce, typically it's permanent. Sometimes, very rare cases, do they get back together? However, the majority of time, loss and grief is a permanent fixed thing. However, it does not become so heavy to bear, and so I always refer to it as a weight. Whether it's I was following a nurse on TikTok, Nurse Hadley. She refers to it as a backpack. I like to refer to it as rocks when I'm treading water. As you start anything new, you are new to it. You're not going to be the best as you are. You don't just run a 10-mile marathon. However, if I have been working up and managing my responses and learning coping skills, then I am building the muscle I need to get to that 10-mile marker. So little at a time, I become more experienced at managing the grief. And we call them grief managers. But it becomes easier for me. So is, Christmas always going to be hard when I am now a single parent and this is something that, I never saw for myself? Yes. Is it going to be as hard as that first time? No. What else do I have? Okay. So, we are Breakthrough. We are here to support the community. I know I sent some handouts, so you have our information should we need. I do focus a lot on grief and trauma. I love doing classes. I love doing presentations. So if you need us for anything, please, keep us in mind. I hope this was helpful. Um, yes, I hope this was helpful. And I'm so sorry I went over, but thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Adriana. No problem. We love it when it's interactive. So just a very quick thank you to you and Breakthrough Therapeutics for all of you for joining us today and hanging in there. We want you to join us at our next children's webinar, August 21st at 11:30, hosted by Patty Stein from Pure Play Every Day, Incorporated for mindfulness and playfulness, two sides of the same coin. You can be a children's advocate all year. So you can still sign up to be a champion and stay connected with us. You'll be joining a growing network of Marylanders advocating for the mental well-being of children and communities across the state. We'll be sure to, in the follow-up email, you'll receive the survey if you haven't already accessed it to the chat. and information on how to get information from Breakthrough and connect you with Adriana and include those resources. So thank you once again. We hope you have a great rest of your week.